Hello everyone and welcome to our usual monthly meetup, CoffeeJug. Today we have Micah from US, actually New York, and today we will hear amazing talk about OAuth, different pitfalls and remedies. So let's go and welcome in the CoffeeJug online meetup. So actually, the main goal why we do this is always about community. Having strong and healthy community will give us much more opportunities than, I don't know, self-learning or something like that. Community is a synergy, right? So that's why we do this. And today is our anniversary event, 12th event. So a year ago, it was our first event, and today it's a 12th. So we have a 474 unique participants. And actually, I have a little spoiler for all of you. We prepare a birthday party. It will be not like very usual, so please follow us. And it will be actually very, I would say, limited, because we are not allowed to build huge groups of people. So please keep your attention, keep your eyes on our group in Facebook and Twitter. Here is organizers, everyone is here. One day, actually, I will show it right now. Here is our team. Yeah, everyone is here, not only me. Everyone is care about the quality. We are open to feedbacks. And here's our program committee, people who help us to find speakers, people who help young speakers review them and actually build the great talks for all of you. Also, many thanks for our actually usual partner, Avenga, for their support, for their trust and commitment into Lviv's and actually in Ukrainian communities. Thank you so much. And thank you for our usual community partner, JetBrains. We will raffle out licenses from JetBrains, but only between those people who will fill the feedback form. Please do this, and you will have a chance to get the free one-year license. Okay, let me switch the notifications, actually. Also, we have activity bonus. Everyone who will ask the questions during presentations will have a chance to get the tasty bonuses from a CoffeeJug. We will deliver it to you by delivery boy, so don't worry, you don't need to go somewhere to get this bonus. That's it. Join the talk, follow us in our groups, and yeah, have a nice evening.
Okay, welcome everybody. Congratulations on your anniversary, CoffeeJug. Today is my actual birthday, so we can celebrate together. But I'm delighted to be with you all today. And you know, a silver lining of the global pandemic we're all hopefully getting through healthy is that we get connected this way when maybe otherwise we wouldn't be. So my name is Micah Silverman. I'm a senior security hacker at Okta, and this slide is just by way of introducing me. In the lower left corner, there's a QR code where if you scan it, you can get the slide deck, and it brings you to a GitHub repository that has this slide deck and all of the different examples that we'll be talking about today. I also have that QR code at the end of the slide deck, so don't feel like you have to race to take a picture of it right now. A little bit of background about me. I contributed to this book, Mastering Enterprise Java Beans, just in time for that technology to be irrelevant, but it's something that I'm proud of. And I contribute to a number of open source projects, including the Java JWT project, which is the most starred JSON Web Token project on GitHub. I also contribute a lot to Okta's developer blog, and if you're not familiar with what Okta is a cloud-based identity service, and we'll see at the end there's a free tier for Okta. If you want to play around with OAuth and OpenID Connect, you can sign up for the free developer tier and have access to everything that we're going to talk about today. But I contribute to the blog pretty regularly, mainly on topics about Java and security and OpenID Connect and OAuth, so you can check that out if that's something you're interested in also. So before we jump into the examples, I like to take a step back. A lot of times if you're not familiar with OAuth or you're trying to find out information about OAuth, you kind of get lost in the weeds pretty quickly of specifications and deep code dives. And I like to come at it from a different way and give a little bit of context and background. Why does OAuth exist? Why does it matter? And then rather than just talk about how OAuth works, I like to talk about how the vulnerabilities of OAuth and how to avoid them. So to understand where OAuth comes from, we jump into a little time machine and go back to 2007. And what we had in 2007 were simple logins on websites, forms and cookies. E-commerce was a thing. Amazon existed then. We could buy things online, but there wasn't a lot of site-to-site interaction. They were all kind of siloed websites. We also had a standard by then for single sign-on across sites, which is SAML, and that's still used today. But it's an older it's an older standard for single sign-on, and it's usually only found in the context of enterprise. So if you're working on a hobby project, it's not likely, or even a small company, it's not likely that you're going to be using SAML. But in 2007, it definitely was only accessible to the enterprise. So big banks and insurance companies might start using SAML for single sign-on across different websites. Mobile app login was a big question mark. To put it in context, in 2007, that was the very first year that the iPhone was released. And so mobile was not a solved problem at that point. In fact, if you look at articles back then, there were as many articles criticizing the iPhone as there were supporting it. A lot of articles were saying things like, well, you know, who's going to want a $400 computer in their pocket, or, you know, who's going to browse the web on a 4-inch screen. So mobile was not a solved problem. But this idea of delegated authorization started to emerge, and that's because we started to want to provide data between services and websites. So at the time, this is an actual screenshot from Yelp. If you're not familiar with Yelp, it's a restaurant review service. It's popular in the US. I honestly don't know if it's popular outside the US, but it allows you to post reviews of restaurants. It allows you to connect with your friends, and you can decide on a place to go eat, that sort of thing. So back in 2007, what started to emerge was, hey, I want to share my contacts with Yelp so that I can see which of my friends are already on Yelp and invite those friends that aren't to join Yelp, so we can all look at restaurant reviews together or all decide on a restaurant to go to together. So the form looked like this. You'd choose the email service provider, you'd put in your email address and password, and then Yelp would go and log in as you, and it would grab all of your contacts and then give you a result screen where you would see a list of your contacts. Facebook used the same kind of form. They were using this form up until about 2010. And if you notice on this form, it says Facebook will not store your password. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but from the lens of 2020, we have a lot of examples of security breaches, passwords in plain text getting dumped onto the internet and sold. And so we definitely don't want to do things this way. In 2007, this was really the only choice that we had, but we now refer to this as the password anti-pattern. Because what's going on here is really what I'm trying to express is I want Yelp to have very limited access to my contacts. In fact, I want Yelp to only have read-only access to my contacts. And I don't want Yelp getting anywhere near other services that Google provides, like email and Google Docs. But once I give a service like Yelp my Google password, it now can essentially masquerade as me. So it could send emails that my mom would have no way of distinguishing didn't come from me. It could delete my contacts. It could go and scan in all of my Google Docs. That's way more authority than I want to give to Yelp or to Facebook. Also, I'm not in control anymore, meaning if I decide, well, I don't like Facebook anymore, really the only thing I can do is change my Gmail password, which is a very blunt instrument. Ideally, I'd like to have a way to revoke access at any time and stay in control of it. So this is the delegated authorization problem, and the question is, how can I let a website access my data without giving it my password? This was the big question that we were trying to answer in 2007 and 2010 and beyond. And so what emerged out of that is what we now know as the OAuth standard, and we're on OAuth 2.0, so it's gone through a few iterations, but OAuth is what emerged out of this conversation, and it provides a number of different ways that we can give a website or a service access to my data without giving it my password, and also remain in control of it. I can specify exactly what the website or service has access to, how long they have access to it, and I can revoke it at any time. But there's a lot of confusion around OAuth because if you start doing a search for OAuth, you tend to get a lot of terminology and jargon. There's even some incorrect advice out there, and it's hard to find a lifelike example. As humans, we like to deal with analogies and try to relate technologies to kind of everyday interactions, and it's hard to find something like that. You either get specifications, which are really only good for service providers like Okta, who are building an OAuth service, or you get deep dives into code, which are great for us as developers, but it really doesn't give us an understanding of why. It may give us the how, but not really the why. So we're going to attempt to put in a real world analogy here. And every time I do this talk now, I get a little bit sad because my hotel analogy, it's been now, I don't know, 4 or 5 months since I've been able to stay in a hotel. I have traveled quite a lot for the work that I do. And hopefully I'll be able to see you all in person someday in the future. But let's talk about the hotel analogy. The way that we interact with hotels, we have these actors. We have a hotel guest, we have the hotel itself, we have the hotel receptionist and the hotel room. These are kind of the actors that are involved in an interaction with a hotel. And so I'll go and book a room, and then I'll go to the hotel and obtain a hotel key, and then I'll use that key to get access to a specific room. Now, it turns out that the way that we interact with hotels maps onto OAuth in some very specific ways, and some ways that might surprise you or maybe we don't usually think about. First of all, when we get a hotel key, that hotel key has limited scope. Now, in the context of hotels, we don't usually think of the word scope. That's more of a formal technical term that we find in OAuth. But what I mean by that is that hotel key can only access the specific room that's been assigned to me. I can't just go up and down the hall opening doors. That wouldn't be very secure. So scope is important in OAuth 2. A scope might be something like read-only access to contacts as opposed to write access. So scopes determine what an application like Yelp will have access to. The second thing is expiration. When I check out of the hotel, even if I hold on to that hotel key, if I come back the next day and go to that room, that same room that was assigned to me, I can no longer open it because the key is now expired. So in the world of OAuth, we have keys. They're called access tokens, and those access tokens have expiration built into them, similar to the way a hotel key does. And the manager and the hotel receptionist, they don't have to set reminders in their calendars to deactivate the key. The expiration is built into it. It's automatic. So then the third thing is something that drives home one of the key areas of confusion with OAuth, and that is OAuth is a framework for authorization, and it often gets mixed up with concerns of authentication. But OAuth is squarely about authorization, and if you want to deal with authentication and SSO and those concerns, that's where OpenID Connect comes in. Now, the way that this works with a hotel room, how we can talk about authorization is that the door doesn't care who you are. It's not about identity. So when I go to open the door, if my arms are full, if I'm dragging a bunch of luggage behind me, I can hand my hotel key off to my wife, and she can open the door just as well as I can. Because all the door is checking for is this a valid key? Is it meant for this room? And is it not expired? That's all it's checking. It's not checking identity. So in the world of OAuth, we refer to this type of key as a bearer token. So an OAuth access token is a bearer token, meaning that who's ever in control of that key can use it with an API, and the API is not going to check the identity of who's ever using it. That's why it's very critical in OAuth that we not leak access tokens. So in modern hotel keys, they're usually like credit card size keys, and they usually don't have any room identifying information on them. Maybe they have the name of the hotel or some advertisement, but because of the fact that it's a bearer token, if I drop that key in the lobby, somebody could use that key, but only if they know the room that it's assigned to. So in the old days, when we dealt with physical keys, they would often have the room number stamped on them, and that was kind of a security risk. Those are bearer tokens also, and if I drop that kind of key in a hotel lobby and the room number is stamped right on it, somebody can go right to the room and open the door, because the door doesn't care who you are, it's just looking to make sure that the key fits the lock. All right, now with that hotel analogy under our belt, we can look to OAuth now and put this same sort of interaction into an application scenario. So this time we have different actors, but they're all kind of in the same positions as the previous slide. So this time we have an end user, we have Yelp, we have Google, and we have a contacts API. And the end user is going to delegate access to Yelp, and Yelp is going to go and obtain an access token from Google so that it can use that access token to interact with the contacts API. Now, the contacts API is not going to be checking to see if it's Yelp. It's just going to be checking to see that the access token is valid, it's not expired, and the scope is correct. So again, that's the distinction between authorization and authentication, and we'll look at that a little more as we go here. So now we can, with those two scenarios under our belt, we can look at some formal OAuth terms, and the third column in this table are the terms that you would find in the OAuth specification. So our end user, that's you sitting in front of the browser, you're referred to as the resource owner. And it kind of makes sense because you have resources like your contacts, that's a resource, and you own those resources. And part of the whole motivation of OAuth is that you retain control over those resources. So the resource owner wants a client app to do something on their behalf. Then we have the client application itself. In our example, that would be Yelp. So Yelp needs authorization to interact with an API on behalf of the user. We then have the authorization server. That's the entity that's responsible for granting access tokens to an application. So Yelp goes and gets an access token from Google. And then finally, we have the resource server. And the resource server has an API that an app can use if presented with a token. So the resource server, so Yelp obtains the access token. It then uses the access token to make an API call to the contacts API. And it's the contacts API responsibility to validate that access token, to make sure that it's not expired, and to make sure that the scope is correct. So if Yelp has an access token that has read-only access scope to my contacts, and Yelp attempts to write to my contacts, the contacts API will reject that request because it knows that the scope that's been granted doesn't allow it to do that. So you can see this is a much more fine-grained instrument, a much more precise instrument than using a username and password. And now I no longer have to give my username and password to Yelp. So now with delegated authorization, we can say I trust Gmail and I kind of trust Yelp. I want Yelp to have access to my contacts only. And so now rather than putting in my username and password, we have this friendly connect with Google button, and we've probably all seen this on various websites. When we click on that connect with Google button, it kicks off an interaction with all the actors that we discussed on the previous slides. And that kind of interaction in OAuth is called a flow. Now, there are a number of different types of flows defined in OAuth, depending on the context and what it is that you're trying to accomplish and how you're doing it. So there's a different flow for a mobile app than there would be for a web-based app. There's a different flow for a single-page web-based app than there would be for an input-constrained device like an Apple TV or a Roku or an Amazon Fire TV stick. So OAuth defines these different flows for different types of interactions, and we're going to take a look at a few of them. Now, the first one we're going to look at is called the implicit flow, but I'll give you a spoiler alert, and that is the implicit flow has been deprecated because it has security problems, and we're going to look at those security problems. First, we're going to examine the flow, and then we're going to look at how you can hack the implicit flow. But it is the simplest of the flows that doesn't require me to give a password to the client application. So it's instructive to look at the flow, and it's also useful to see kind of what the motivation for this flow is and why it's been deprecated. It's also worthwhile to take a step back here and talk a little bit about the standards process. And so OAuth 2.0 defines the implicit flow. OAuth 2.1 is being actively worked on right now. In fact, my colleague Aaron Parecki is one of the co-authors of the OAuth 2.1 specification, but it's going to take a while for that specification to be released. So the OAuth 2.1 specification will not have the implicit flow in it. It will no longer be a valid flow. Now, the way the IETF standards process works is that in between releases of the specifications, you can have what are called security best current practice documents, or BCPs. And in 2019, there were 2 security BCPs that were released for OAuth, and they basically, in a nutshell, they say don't use the implicit flow anymore. And we're going to see why in just a second. But let's see what this flow looks like. We click on Connect with Google. And what that does is it kicks off an interaction. And the first thing it does is say, go to the authorization server. So it's sending us over to Google. and it has some information that it sends along. So it sends a redirect URI. The reason for that is when we go to Google, we have to go through a process of identifying ourselves to Google. Once we do that, Google needs to know where to go back to in order to send back an access token. So that's what the redirect URI is for. We also give it a space-separated list of scopes, and we give it this value called response type. The response type indicates what we expect to get back in this part of the interaction, and in this case, we expect to get back an access token directly. Now, right away, we have to pause because this is where some of the confusion comes in around OAuth. I just went through all of this effort to say that OAuth is all about authorization, and yet here I am at an authentication form in Google. So let me explain a little bit. With OAuth, there's an expectation that authentication has happened, but it happens out of band of OAuth. What I mean by that is OAuth is sending me over to Google in this case to identify myself, but OAuth doesn't care about what that mechanism is. So to give you an example, the most typical use case is email and password, right? But after I supply my email and password to Google, I might have to do a second factor. Maybe I get a push notification on my phone, or maybe I have to look at a Google Authenticator app and paste in that 6-digit number. So the authentication may be complex. The way that I identify myself to the service may be complex, and OAuth doesn't care about any of it. As another example, Okta is now rolling out a fancy new passwordless feature where you don't have to put in a password at all when you identify yourself to Okta. So now when I log into Okta, I put in my email address, and then I tap my YubiKey, and then I get a push notification to my phone, and that's how I identify myself to Okta, but I never have to put in a password. And again, OAuth doesn't care about that mechanism. So OAuth has an expectation that you've identified yourself to the authorization server, but it happens out of band, outside of the OAuth flow. Now, if that's not completely clear, there'll be time at the end I can answer questions, but just take it as a given for now. And that's why I choose my words carefully as well. I don't say I authenticate to Google, although that's what's happening. I say I'm identifying myself to the service because that can take any number of forms, and OAuth doesn't care about it. What OAuth does care about is what happens next, and that is requesting consent. You've probably seen these consent forms, and the reason this is so important to OAuth is that the consent form is a direct reflection of the scopes that were requested. Now, this is another dimension of OAuth that can be confusing at times, and that is this notion of scopes and how scopes work. So Yelp can request any scopes that it wants. Yelp can request the send email on my behalf scope. It could request the write to my contacts scope. It could request access to my Google Docs. All of those are different scopes that Google understands. But the critical part here is that on the consent form tells me what it is that Yelp is asking for access to. And it's my opportunity to grant that permission or not. So Yelp or any client can ask for any scope. And if you ever go to a site and you see a very long list of scopes, that's probably something that should raise a red flag, because in most cases, applications don't need a lot of scope. Really, all Yelp needs access to is my contacts and read-only access. But this is our opportunity to grant that access or not. Now, if you're like my mom, you're going to click on the yes button no matter what it says, but hopefully we'll be a little more discerning and we'll actually read what it is that Yelp is requesting access to. Now, assuming that we click on yes, the next thing that happens is Google is going to use that redirect URI to send back a token, an access token. And that's it. That's the whole implicit flow. We go to Google, we identify ourselves, we consent, and then Google redirects back to the application with an access token. And now this application, let's imagine it's like an Angular app. Now that the Angular app has an access token, it can interact with the Contacts API to go and read in all of my contacts. All right, now hopefully this is clear, but we're going to talk about problems with the implicit flow. And in order to do that, we need to add in some additional terminology for OAuth. In the world of OAuth, we have this notion of a back channel and a front channel. The back channel is highly secure, and generally speaking, the back channel is for server-to-server communication. The front channel is less secure, and generally anything that passes through your browser's address bar is the front channel. So if we revisit this diagram that we saw, you'll notice that all of the interactions, the solid lines with the arrows, that's all happening on the front channel. And the redirect back is happening on the front channel. What that means is that the access token is passing through your browser's address bar. Now, hopefully this is starting to give a little tickle in your brain that might be problematic, because anything that passes through the browser's address bar, that is the front channel, is by definition less secure, because malicious JavaScript, compromised machines, malware, viruses, misbehaving browser extensions, they can all have access to your browser's address bar. And if you remember earlier, we said that an access token is a bearer token. So if you leak an access token, or if there's a way for that access token to get intercepted, now some malicious third party can read all of your contacts, and that may not be something that you want them to be able to do. Okay, so when the application makes a post request, an HTTP post request to the Contacts API, that's a back channel communication, the dotted line, and that is a little bit more secure, or significantly more secure, I should say. All right, so let's look at our first demo. It's the Implicit Flow Detector, and the purpose of this browser extension that I wrote is to detect websites, public websites that are still using the implicit flow. We're going to talk about a little later on, we're going to talk about what flow you should be using instead of the implicit flow. So we'll get there. But this little example catches sites that are using the implicit flow. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to jump over to medium.com. You may or may not have heard of Medium. It's a popular blogging framework, blogging website. People go and post articles there, and it's kind of an aggregator of articles in different for different websites. Now I will show you up here in the corner this little blue shield. That is the Implicit Flow Detector browser extension, and this extension is publicly available on both for Firefox and for Chrome. And it doesn't do anything malicious. All it does is notify you when it's captured an access token, but you shouldn't take my word for it. It's an open source project, and you can go and look at the source code and prove to yourself that it's not doing anything malicious. But part of the point that I want to make here is that it could be doing something malicious, because it's intercepting access tokens, and it could do, you know, a less scrupulous browser extension could do something malicious with the access tokens that it intercepts. All right, let's see what I'm talking about here. If I go to sign in, this is kind of the familiar form that we've seen, these different buttons. I can sign in with Google, Facebook, Apple, etc. Now, if I sign in with Google, it's going to ask me which account I want to use. I'm going to choose my main Gmail account, and now I'm logged into Medium. All right, so far so good. Now you may have noticed that our little blue shield has now turned red, and if I go and expand that, I can see that it's captured an ID token and an access token from Medium. Now, the ID token is something that has to do with OpenID Connect. We're not going to get into OpenID Connect today, but the ID token has some personally identifying information in it already. So, for instance, it's got my email address, and it looks like maybe that's all it's got right now. So that is problematic. I don't want my email address necessarily leaking out just because a browser extension can see it. And if you notice that the little arrow here is yellow, leaking an ID token is not great, but it's not a critical error. However, leaking the access token, that little arrow is red because that is a bad thing. This is a Google access token. And now I can copy that access token.
Computer systems.
Oh, I said Google too many times. It activated my phone. I can copy that access token, and now I can open an incognito window, private window, so there's no context here. I'm not logged in. I'm not on Google at all. And now I can go to googleapis.com. Let's see if I remember this. Wait, is it OAuth 2 v3? I forget. Oh, there it is. Yeah, OAuth 2 v3 token info. You can see that I've gone there before. Access token equals. And now, because it's a bearer token, the Google API is giving me some information about this token. First of all, I can see the scopes that are associated with this token. So the email scope and the profile scope are available in this token. Once again, I can also see my email address, so that's been leaked also. But it's worse than that. There's another Google endpoint called user info, and I can pass it that access token as well. And now I have even more information. Now I have a full name, I have a gender, and I have a profile picture, which you can see what I looked like in 1991. Maybe I didn't want that leaking out all over the web. So this is why the implicit flow is problematic. It's too easy to intercept access tokens. And like I said, the browser extension itself is just providing information, but a more malicious browser extension could do something with that information, like start harvesting email addresses or harvesting, genders or some other information that just because you logged in with Medium, you didn't expect. Now, you may be asking the question, well, who's responsible for this problem? And I would assert that this is Medium's problem, and I'll explain why. There is some part of the problem that's Google. Google supports the implicit flow, even though it's been deprecated. But companies like Google and Okta that I work for, they're kind of in a difficult situation because the official release of OAuth 2 has the implicit flow, and the general guidance now is that we shouldn't be using the implicit flow. So Google, as well as Okta, continue to support the implicit flow, but it's not enabled by default, and there's a lot of documentation that says don't use this flow, there's a better way. So on Medium's side of the fence, Medium has chosen to use the implicit flow when they could have used a better alternative. So this may kind of be in the realm of opinion. In my opinion, the majority of the blame here would go to Medium for continuing to use the implicit flow when there are better alternatives, which we're going to look at later. All right, so as I said, the implicit flow detector, you can install that in your browser, and it will alert you to websites that are using the implicit flow. And I'm about to do an update where it's going to inspect DNS records, and if possible, it's going to give you the administrator email address so that if you do encounter websites that are still using the implicit flow, you can notify them and hopefully they'll change their ways. If Medium goes and updates to the Pixie flow, which we'll look at later, then I'll have to change my demo because it won't work anymore. All right, let's continue on. Let's talk about confidential clients and public clients. So confidential clients are applications running on a server that you have complete control over. So Yelp's application, let's say it's a .NET application, it's running in their server, it's running in their data center, it's behind their firewall. If it's a physical machine, it's in a cage somewhere that only they have access to. So we would call that a confidential client because it's under the complete control of Yelp. And importantly, confidential clients can keep secrets. That's going to be important in just a moment. Public clients, on the other hand, are applications where it's not safe to store a secret. So JavaScript single-page apps or native apps or mobile apps, those are all examples of public clients. And it's just not safe to store secrets in those type of applications. And believe me, developers have tried and they always get caught. So don't try to be tricky and take a secret and break it up into multiple parts and store it in different places in your JavaScript app. Somebody's going to figure it out. And even though native and mobile apps are binary payloads, they can be decompiled and you can extract strings, and you have no control over these public clients. That's part of the message here also. So if you're Yelp and you have, say, 10 million users worldwide, it's likely that some of those 10 million users are going to have compromised devices. They're going to have malware or viruses or malicious browser extensions, and you just have no control over that. So to sum it up, confidential clients are clients that are in complete control of the vendor or the company that owns them. Public clients is everything else, and the provider, the vendor, the application can't control them, and so it's not safe to store secrets in them. Now, why this is relevant is when we get into our next flow, the authorization code flow. The authorization code flow defeats the malicious browser extension, as we'll see in a little bit, and it relies on a client secret in order to do that because it's running on a confidential client. So let's take a look at that. So now we're starting where we started before. We're on a website. We go to yelp.com and we connect with Google. Now, this is still front channel communication, so less secure communication, but all we're doing so far is redirecting over to Google, and you'll notice that our response type has changed now. Instead of token, the response type now is code, meaning at the end of this interaction, we expect to get back this thing called an authorization code instead of getting back the token directly. And we still give it a scope. We identify ourselves just like we did before. We get to the consent screen just like we did before. And assuming we consent, we redirect back, but this time, instead of redirecting back with a token, we redirect back with an authorization code. Now, that's still happening on the front channel. So as security professionals, we're going to assume that that authorization code has been intercepted. So let's imagine that same browser extension is now intercepting the authorization code, and we're going to see in just a moment how that gets defeated. So now this is Yelp's .NET application running on Yelp's server, and so now Yelp has this authorization code. Now Yelp speaks directly to Google on the back channel, and it exchanges the authorization code for an access token. This is much more secure because this does not go through your browser's address bar. It's an HTTP post, so the response comes back in the same request. in the same data channel. And most importantly, this requires a client secret. So Yelp is going to pass the authorization code along with a client secret that was issued to it by Google. Google's going to validate that client secret, and it's going to exchange the code for a token. And so now Yelp has an access token that it can use to interact with the Contacts API. And going back to our browser, if you remember, our malicious browser extension intercepted that authorization code. Now, it's protected in a couple of ways. First of all, that authorization code is a one-time use code. And second of all, it requires the client secret in order to exchange it. That client secret is safely stored over on Yelp's server in their data center behind their firewall. And so there's no way for the browser extension to know what that client secret is. And so now the browser extension is effectively defeated because there's no way for it to exchange that code for a token. So while this flow is much more complex than the implicit flow, hopefully you can see that it's also much more secure. Now we're going to look at an exploit in just a moment that messes around with the authorization code flow. But you may have the question, well, this is great for traditional web applications, your .NET, your Spring Boot applications, but what about SPA apps? What about mobile apps? We want a way for SPA apps and mobile apps to take advantage of this more secure flow, but to do so in a way that doesn't require a secret, because it's not safe to have a fixed secret on those types of apps. And that'll bring us to the Pixie flow, which we'll look at in just a little bit. All right, let's continue on with the authorization code flow. And what we're going to look at next is a theoretical attack that I have developed a practical implementation of to be able to show you as a demonstration. So this is a known attack. If you look at the latest security best current practices, it mentions this attack. It's called the authorization code injection attack. And what I want to demonstrate is one way to accomplish this attack. And the punchline here is that it enables an attacker to assume the identity of a target user by exploiting the authorization code flow. Let's see what that looks like. So first we have our standard set of actors that we've already seen. We have a resource owner, we have an authorization server, and we have a confidential client. Now, a couple things I want to point out here. First of all, I'm going to be using papercall.io. You may have heard of it. It's a website that allows you to post your talks for various conferences. It's something I use all the time. And what I want to point out here is that PaperCall isn't doing anything wrong. Whereas before I was saying Medium is doing something wrong because they're using the implicit flow, PaperCall isn't doing anything wrong here. They've just fallen victim to this attack that I'm about to describe. And there's really only one way for PaperCall to guard against this type of attack, or for any confidential client to guard against this type of attack, and I'll talk about that also. Also, our resource owner isn't just any resource owner. Our resource owner has been tricked into installing a malicious browser extension on their computer. Now, in order for this attack to work, we have some additional actors. We have a centralized attack server, and we have an attacker's computer. And the attacker's computer also has a browser extension that's helping to coordinate this attack. So let's take a look at what it looks like. So first of all, the target user is going to obtain an authorization code just in the normal way. They're going to go to PaperCall. PaperCall is going to send them to Google. Google is going to respond with an authorization code. But here's where the malicious browser extension comes in. The malicious browser extension is going to intercept the redirect from Google, and it's going to publish the authorization code to the centralized attack server. And importantly, it's going to disrupt that redirect and not allow it to get all the way back to PaperCall. That's important because the authorization code is a one-time use, so we don't want pay-per-call using that authorization code. Now, the attacker is going to kick off a normal authorization code flow as well, and the attacker's browser extension is also going to intercept the redirect, and it's then going to peel off the target user's authorization code from the centralized attack server, and it's going to replace it in that redirect URI. So that's where the notion of authorization code injection comes from. I'm taking an authorization code that was sent by the authorization server on behalf of another user, and I'm injecting it into this redirect. Now, what happens next is the redirect is allowed to continue, and so now this redirect with the injected authorization code is sent over to pay-per-call. Pay-per-call sends that authorization code over to Google along with its client secret, and so Google checks to make sure that the code hasn't been used already. It hasn't. And it checks to make sure that the client secret is correct, and it is. So we're basically tricking pay-per-call into exchanging the authorization code, even though we have no knowledge of that secret. We don't need to know it. So Google exchanges the code for a token. That token comes back, and now I've now effectively assumed the identity of the target. All right, so now let's take a look at this in action, and I have another demo for you. Now, there's a lot going on this screen, and it's probably small, so I'll make sure to zoom in here, but let me just explain what the setup is here. On the top, we have Chrome, Google Chrome, the Chrome browser, and I'm over at pay-per-call, but I'm not authenticated, so I haven't logged in yet. What I'm looking at is the public profile of this user called HackerDude. And that's the way pay-per-call works. You can have a public profile that you can jump over to, and so that's what we're seeing here. So this is Google Chrome, the Google Chrome browser, and we're looking at the HackerDude's public profile. He's not logged in. And over on the top right, we're looking at the console for the attacker's browser extension, which is this green hash mark up here. That's called Auth Code Sniper. Okay, now on the bottom, we have Firefox, and I wanted to bring this up in a completely different browser just to show that, you know, there's no connection between these two different browsers. So it's not like we're sharing a session or we're attacking cookies or doing anything like that. We're in a completely different browser. So this is Firefox. And down here, we're looking at our target user called the Rube Dude. And a rube is an English term. If you're not familiar with it, a rube is somebody that you're going to take advantage of. So that's kind of an English idiom. So that's why I called this a Rube Dude. And in case you're not familiar with SpongeBob SquarePants, that is a tourist from that cartoon show. So here's our Rube, here's our target user that we're going to take advantage of. Now, the target user has been tricked into installing this browser extension called the Pretty Cats browser extension. So you can go and look at GIFs of cats when you're supposed to be working, and it looks like it's super cute, but in fact, it's up to no good. And then on the right here, we have the console output for this browser extension as well. All right. So let's see the authorization code injection attack in action. Oh, and by the way, the attack server that I spoke about is a Spring Boot application. So I already have this running. So it's a little Spring Boot application that's going to be the place where I can park and retrieve these authorization codes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and log in with Google like I normally would. And so now it's asking me to log in, and this is a real account that I set up. And in fact, I'm going to have to unlock my password vault because I don't remember what that password is. Bear with me a second here. There we go. So I'm logging in the way that I normally would with Google, and I click on Next. Now, a couple of things have happened. First of all, you'll notice that we've intercepted, this browser extension has intercepted the authorization code, and it's published that authorization code on our attack server. So our Spring Boot app has received this authorization code. Now, from the end user perspective, they are not in an authenticated state. That might be a little disorienting for them. They might be left scratching their head. I just tried to log in and it didn't happen. Well, as an end user, even a savvy user, you might scratch your head and just say, well, I'm going to try it again. The second time you try it, the browser extension lets it go through. And so now I'm in an authenticated state, and an ordinary user would just say, oh, well, there was just some internet hiccup. These things happen, but I'm where I want to be now, so everything's fine. All right, let's switch over to our hacker. Now, the hacker is going to log in with Google also, and we need to do it this way so that the hacker is establishing a real connection to Google. That's important to make this all work. So I still authenticate as the hacker, but we're going to see in just a moment, it happens pretty quickly. If you look over here, the browser extension in the hacker's browser, it intercepts the authorization code that was assigned by Google, and it replaces it with the authorization code that it found on our attack server. So it pulls the authorization code off of the attack server. So here the message is that this code was consumed, and then it replaces it, it injects it into that redirect, and then it sends it back over to PaperCall, and we can see that the end result is that our hacker, without knowing PaperCall's client secret and without knowing Rube's password, has now assumed the identity of RubeDude. And in the case of PaperCall, I could go and look at all of the Rube's talks. If this were something else, if this were, say, a banking site, I could maybe transfer money to myself as a bad hacker. So that is the authorization code injection hack. And there's a lot of theoretical documents, proofs of concept. This is the first practical application that I've seen of it, but it does require a user to be tricked into installing a malicious browser extension. But, you know, if you saw a browser extension like this, how could you think that was malicious? It's just showing you pictures of cats. It's so cute. All right. Now, we talked about the implicit flow and the problems with the implicit flow. We talked about the authorization code flow, and what we just saw was a hack on a confidential client, right? Ordinarily, confidential clients are supposed to be our safe place. But there's an extension to the authorization code flow that addresses both of those issues. It addresses both the implicit flow problem and it addresses the vulnerability to authorization code injection. And that flow is called authorization code plus PKCE, PKCE. It stands for proof key for code exchange. Let me just bring that up over here. So it's proof key for code exchange. It's its own specification, and it's an extension to OAuth. And in OAuth 2.1, it's going to be formalized as what you should always be using. So with OAuth 2, you can use the authorization code flow, or you can use the authorization code plus PXE flow. In OAuth 2.1, you're always going to be using the authorization code plus PXE flow, whether it's a confidential client or a public client. So let's see how this PXE flow works and how it addresses these issues. All right, so, oh, and by the way, this is like a more formal sequence diagram. If you've never seen them before, we have our actors on these lanes across the top, and then we see how these actors interact with each other from left to right and top to bottom. So the resource owner goes and accesses the app. This is where I put yelp.com in my browser. Now, here's the first bit of business that PXE does. And by the way, I should take a step back. I just want to mention that PXE is an extension to the authorization code flow. And what it does is it does a little bit of setup, and then it does the regular authorization code flow, and then it does a little bit of validation at the end. So what we're seeing here is the little bit of setup. So it creates a random value, which we'll call V, and then it takes a hash of that random value, which we'll call $. So that's the setup. It creates a random value, and it creates a hash of that value. The next thing it does is it redirects to the authorization server with that random, with that hashed value, that $. Now this does go through the authorization, or rather, hold on one sec. I just have to message my wife really quick because my dog is starting to bark. There we go. Okay. Now, the hashed value is passing through your browser's address bar. So let's assume for a moment that that hashed value is intercepted by, say, a malicious browser extension. Now, the way that modern hashing works is they're called one-way hashing algorithms, and you may be familiar with them in the context of passwords. The idea is that with today's computing power, it's not practically possible to take a hashed value and reverse it back to its original value. So even if something intercepts this hashed value, there's no way for it practically to reverse it and get back that value V that we started with. So hold on to that for a second. The important thing here is that the authorization server is going to store that hashed value for later. Okay, now at this point, we're in the regular old authorization code flow. So the authorization server is going to return a login form, or you're going to identify yourself to the authorization server. You're going to see the consent form. You're going to give consent for the scopes that were requested. All of that is like normal. And then the authorization server is going to redirect with an authorization code, just like it did before. So just like before, we're going to assume that the browser has intercepted the authorization code that comes back. Now, before, the way that our malicious browser extension was defeated was that it didn't have access to the fixed client secret, so there was no way for it to exchange the authorization code for a token. This time, rather than having a fixed client secret, which is not safe to do in a public client, rather we pass over that random value V. So that random value V is a stand-in for a fixed client secret. So it's a dynamic random value, and it gets newly created every time we go through the flow. So this is a way to manage the insecurity of a public client. So we send over the authorization code, or I should say the client sends over the authorization code and that original random value V. It does this as a post, so it doesn't go through your browser's address bar. And now The authorization server is going to validate that random value V by hashing it and comparing it to the hash that it stored earlier. This is very similar to the way that modern identity services like Okta and others deal with your passwords. So Google never stores your plain text password. Rather, when you create a Google account, it hashes your plain text password and saves the hash. Then when you go to authenticate, it takes the plain text password that you've supplied and it hashes it and it compares it to the hash that it has in its database. That way, even if that database is compromised, as I said before, there's no practical way to reverse that hash back to your plain text password. It's the same thing with our random value V here. So the authorization server is going to hash that random value V and compare it to the hashed value that it stored up at the beginning of the flow. So this is a way for a public client to take advantage of the authorization code flow without having to have a fixed client secret. It also is an extra protection for a confidential client, and we'll see that in just a little bit when I demonstrate when I demonstrate the authorization code injection attack again. But first, let's take a look at, and then the token is returned to the client, and now the client can use that token to interact with the API. Okay. Now, before I show the authorization code injection attack foiled, let me just show you a Pixie example really quick. So bear with me here a second. I'm going to kill my Spring Boot app, and I'm going to bring up another tab here. I forgot to set this up in advance, but let me just show you Pixie in action here. I have an example called the Pixie CLI. So this is a Node.js example, but it's effectively behaving as a native application would. And all you have to do is give it an Okta org and a client ID. A client ID we didn't talk about specifically. A client ID uniquely identifies an application in a service provider. With Okta and with Google, you can have any number of applications, and so the client ID uniquely identifies the application. So I kick off Pixie CLI, and the first thing it does, similar to the diagram that we just saw, is it generates our random value V and the hashed value of that random value. Now, in technical terms, the random value is called the code verifier, and the hashed version of the random value is called the code challenge. It's then going to construct an authorization URL, and if you notice, at the end of that authorization URL, it includes two additional query string parameters. It's got a code challenge method, and we need that hint to tell the authorization server what hashing method was used, so it can use the same one. And we have the value of the code challenge itself. Now, when I hit the any key, it's going to kick off the browser, and now I have to go identify myself to Okta, which I can do, let's see, right here. And then it uses the redirect URI that I supplied to send back an authorization code, which we can see in the URL right here. So now the browser is telling me that the authorized step is complete. I can close this tab, and now I have an authorization code, and so now I want to go and exchange that authorization code for tokens. Well, I do that by providing that same client ID and the authorization code I got and the original code verifier. And I'm going to post that now to Okta's token endpoint, and it now exchanges that authorization code for an access token. Now, what we didn't see behind the scenes, Okta took this code verifier and it hashed it, and it compared the hash with the hashed value that we sent in originally, And since they matched, it sent me back an access token. And then the last thing it does is it uses that access token to hit a protected endpoint to send back information about who I am. This user info endpoint gives me gives back more information about the user, and it requires an access token. So this is just kind of proving that we have a valid access token. All right, last demonstration is going to be, let me restart this. Last demonstration is going to be to revisit the authorization code injection attack and see how Pixie kind of saves us from that attack. So same scenario here. Let me just go and log out in each of these. I want to log out, and I also want to log out from Google. I can do that up here. And let me also log out from Google down here. Okay. Now, first, I'm gonna redo the authorization code injection attack with a different site. This is a very basic site called avocado.lol, and it's actually my my colleague Aaron set it up. Whoops, I got to spell avocado right though. Avocado. That's the hardest part, is spelling avocado right. There we go. And I'm going to do the same thing up here. Avocado.lol. All right. Now let me just clear these out. So first, I'm going to reiterate the same demonstration that I did before, only this time I'm going to do it with this very lean site called avocado.lol. So just like before, I'm going to log in with Google. I'm going to log in as the Rube dude here. I'm going to properly authenticate. I intercepted the code. We saw that before. And I got dumped back to the front door, just like we saw before. Now, if I go back to Google and I click login with Google, now it's going to let me through, and I can see this information like an access token came back. So I'm all good here. And now I'm going to do the same thing up here that I did before. I'm going to log in with Hacker. There we go. And we can see that it intercepted the code and it replaced it with the one that it had saved. And I'm effectively signed in as Rube Dude. Okay. Now, the whole point of that was just to reiterate what I did before, but really it's so that I can show you how using Pixie on a confidential client will save us from that. So I'm going to log out one more time. Okay, and now this time I'm going to go to a Pixie version of this application, pixie.php. This was graciously written for me by my colleague Aaron, who can put together an OAuth client in about 10 minutes. All right, so now I'm going to use the Pixie flow instead of the regular authorization code flow. Now, it starts out looking the same, so I'm going to log in with Google. And just like before, I'm going to log in with the Rube. Okay, just like before, the code was intercepted and published. And now I could go back to Google and be in an authenticated state. Now we're going to see how this authorization code injection attack gets defeated. So I'm going to log in with Google. I'm going to log in with the hacker. Okay, now you'll notice that it tried to replace the code just like it did before, but you'll notice that it says invalid code verifier. So because of the fact that we have no control, remember, it's the application that generates the code verifier and the code challenge, and my little malicious browser extension has no way of knowing what that code verifier was from Yelp. So now when it replaces the authorization code, Google is smart enough to realize that the code verifier doesn't match that's coming from Yelp, and it returns this error. So the punchline here is that using Pixie is a good protection even for confidential clients. All right. Now, I'm going to leave this slide up. This has the same QR code. It brings you to a GitHub repo that has the whole slide deck, and it has all the examples that we went through. It's got a couple of others that we didn't go through, but good references for you. And now I can pause because I've been talking for a real long time. And I just want to thank you for your time and attention. It's really been my pleasure to be with you, and I can answer any questions that you may have. So thanks.
Thank you, Micah. Actually, we have probably 30 or 14 seconds delay between our call and the actual stream. However, I see tons of questions in the YouTube chat, so we don't need to wait. I will try to read them to you, and you are welcome to respond. So.
Sure.
Some of the questions were related exactly to the context when you talk, and I'm not sure that it's a good idea to read them. So I hope that those who wrote that actually questions can rephrase it to more general. But I see a few of them. So
sure.
First is from Alexander, and the question is, what Micah ideas on hybrid flow? Does it make sense for you, or it's also related?
Yeah. The hybrid flow is something that OpenID Connect introduced, and we didn't talk a lot about OpenID Connect. I'll share my opinion with you, and I'll preface it by saying that my opinion reflects a lot of the security community, and that is the hybrid flow is kind of a disaster, frankly. The idea of the hybrid flow is that you can do the implicit flow and the code flow all at once. So you get back both an access token, which may be useful for a SPA app, and you get back an authorization code, which your Spring Boot app could then exchange for an access token and an ID token. Now, it's not that critical to leak an ID token, or it's not as critical, I should say, but it still will have personally identifying information. So really, you don't want to leak it. The reason it's not as bad to leak an ID token is that at least it can't be used as a bearer token. Like, you can't use an ID token in place of an access token. So at least it can't be used as a bearer token. But, you know, being a security professional, I'm jaded and I don't want to leak anything I don't have to. So I dislike the use of the hybrid flow as a security professional. And one thing that I will say, it comes up a lot when I sit with our customers. They say, well, you know, we're building a SPA app, and so we need the SPA app to have tokens. Now, I will say the most secure footing to have is that your SPA app never sees a token. And the reason I say that is if you have middleware, and at least in my experience, almost all our customers do. And what I mean by middleware is you have your SPA app, but you also have a Spring Boot or a .NET app, something running on a server. If you have something running on a server, then you can do the authorization code flow, and then your Spring Boot app gets the tokens. The tokens never come down to the browser, And then you can just leverage the regular session mechanism from your SPA app to your middleware, and your SPA app never needs to see tokens. So let's just say, for instance, you have a SPA app that wants to read my Google contacts. Well, rather than sending an access token directly to your SPA app, instead, you have the Spring Boot middleware, and now the SPA app makes a request of the Spring Boot middleware, leveraging the regular old session mechanism of say, Spring Security. And now your Spring Boot app goes and makes the request of the Contacts API using that access token. It gets a JSON response, and it sends that JSON response back to your SPA app. So you can still get a list of all of my contacts without the SPA app ever having tokens, because once tokens make it into a JavaScript app, you've just increased the surface area of attack by a lot. If the tokens never get to the JavaScript app, you have a much smaller surface area of attack. So that was kind of a long-winded answer to say that the hybrid flow is kind of a bad idea.
Okay, thank you. Another question is from Andriy Osta, and the question is, are there other attack scenarios that don't require a malicious browser extensions or compromised user agent or MITM?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Another version of that question that I've heard is, once you have a malicious browser extension with broad authority, it's kind of game over, because that browser extension can access HTTP only cookies and local storage and do all kinds of mischief. I wanted to do a demonstration that was focused on OAuth, but if we look at let's see, is this one it? Yes. There's somewhere in here where it talks about the authorization code injection. And in here, it has a couple of different, or maybe further above, it has a couple of different ways that the attack could happen. The browser extension that I did was the easiest and most practical exploit. Other exploits are much harder. They often require the attacker to do something first and to have the timing very close with the target. But I haven't myself yet put together another approach to another practical application of the authorization code injection attack. One that I will mention is dependent on authorization servers that don't do the right thing. There have been occasions where authorization servers don't honor the specification that says an authorization code should be one-time use only. And people have discovered in the past, I don't know if there's any recently, but people have discovered in the past that they could reuse an authorization code. So if you could find a way to intercept an authorization code, you could reuse it without having to inject it, and that's another way to do it. But if you're interested, you can refer to this BCP, and it has a bunch of other possible approaches. I don't know, what's the best way for me to publish this? Is this something you can publish, this URL, in the YouTube chat?
Yeah, I think that it's visible and everyone can read it from the video stream.
Yeah, and I can also make sure that it's in the in this repo. I can update this repo, and I'll put a link to it also. When you follow that QR code, you end up at this GitHub repository, and I'll put a link to that there also. What else we got?
Okay, cool. Thank you. Another question is from Irina, and it's, what about Selenium? Can I do it without extensions? I assume that the question is more related, is Selenium WebDriver is powerful to do the same like extension? So Yeah, you can answer this.
Yeah, so as a demonstration, probably, I'm not sure how you would do that in practice. Like your target user still has to have a mechanism to leak an authorization code. So there's got to be something. You might be able to pull it off by tricking them into using a proxy. Or, you might be able to pull it off by tricking them into clicking on a link in an email that kicks off the authorization code flow. Like sometimes, like many of us, myself included, are logged into Google all the time, right? So, like where I left things off here, I'm currently logged into Google, right? So if I was tricked into clicking on a link, say in an email, that sent me over to a Google authorization endpoint, it might redirect back and I might not even notice because it happens so fast, right? So that might be a vector of attack also, is like an email with a carefully constructed URL in it. But as far as Selenium, I'm not sure outside of a demo how you could practically accomplish that with a real target. It's a lot easier to get a real target. Oh, and one thing I meant to mention earlier is that it's shockingly easy to get a browser extension with broad authority listed on the official web stores. Case in point, my Implicit Flow detector, it has broad authority. And as I said, it's not doing anything malicious, but it could. And on the Mozilla store, it took a couple of hours for it to get accepted. And on the Google Chrome Web Store, it took about 24 hours for it to get accepted. But then, it's publicly listed on those stores. It's an official thing, and it really wasn't that hard to get them published there. Mozilla calls it add-ons. Right, so if I go here and I do a little search for implicit flow detector, right? So this looks pretty official, right? And it is. It doesn't have a lot of users or ratings yet, but and it's backed by open source code, so it's publicly inspectable. But the point I'm making is that it was really easy to get it listed here. So I think it's kind of low-hanging fruit to trick people like, say, my mom into installing browser extensions. Not to denigrate my mom, by the way. She's awesome. She's just not very tech-savvy.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Another question from Alexander is it more secure to have a short-living access token and refresh it using refreshes token every now and then, every now or then?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And we didn't talk a lot about some of the other mechanisms and token types with OAuth, but there is this other type of token called a refresh token. Its only purpose in life is to go and fetch a new access token when the access token expires. And typically, especially for things like mobile apps, you want a long-lived refresh token and a very short-lived access token. And what that enables you to do is to strike a balance between user experience and security. And a lot of times we don't get the opportunity to strike that balance. A lot of times if we want improved user experience, we have to sacrifice security, or if we want to improve security, we have to sacrifice user experience. In this case, the mechanism of what happens is, let's just say I'm using this app on my mobile phone and I go to transfer money from one account to another. Well, when the access token expires, behind the scenes, the app uses the refresh token to go and fetch a new access token. Now, if everything is fine, if everything's good with my account, a new access token is issued and I'm able to transfer the money, and my user experience is great because I don't have to re-authenticate. On the other hand, if my account has been compromised in some way, let's say I called customer service and I said, I think my account's been compromised, and let's say it's an attacker that's trying to transfer the money, well, when that access token expires and the refresh token is used to go and fetch a new access token, even though the refresh token isn't expired, that operation will fail because my account's been locked or some other administrative operation has happened on that account. And so now the attacker won't be able to successfully transfer the money. So in a typical application, you use refresh tokens to manage security, but still have user convenience. Now, I will say that SPA apps are a special type of app. They're particularly insecure, and most providers will not issue refresh tokens to SPA apps, including Okta. So Okta will issue refresh tokens to mobile apps, but it won't issue refresh tokens to SPA apps. And then you have to have some kind of other mechanism. You know, you still ideally you still want short-lived access tokens, but you may have to have some kind of mechanism that's outside of OAuth to manage that session so that the user doesn't have to re-authenticate a lot. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally. I wanna say that I will read the last question. However, there are much more questions in the YouTube channel, in the YouTube chat. So I wanted to say to everyone that right now you see Micah Twitter account. Please follow him and ask all your questions. I hope you, Micah, will be happy with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, also one another point is I would love if you, Micah, can go to YouTube channel, read all questions, and send us two people who you like questions more than other, I would say, because we have prizes, we have some gifts. It would be cool if you can do this for us. And
Sure.
Right now, I will read the last question. It's pretty long, I would say, but let me read it.
Sure.
Great talk, man. I have a global question. Imagine my application has a connection to the external payment API. This API sends me restrictions depend on pricing plan. Each call goes through my backend server. I want to know how this can be hacked. How can you intercept my restrictions and change the state to free pricing plan, I guess, or from free? I'm not sure exactly.
Right.
So, yeah, that's the question probably.
Yeah, I think I understand it. So, I mean, there are hacks. Remember I said earlier that an application can request whatever scope it wants. So let's say that the normal Yelp application only requests read-only access to my contacts. Well, maybe I can trick a user into making a different authorization request that that has write access to my contacts. And as long as that trick involves me clicking yes on the consent form, then an access token is going to come back that has the write scope included in it. And if that access token is intercepted, now all of a sudden I can write to my contacts. So there's kind of a critical mechanism in OAuth around that consent form, and unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that's it puts a lot more, it puts more what's the word, power in the end user's hands than maybe ideally would really want. So I always go back to the example of my mom. Most of the time, if my mom were to see a consent form like that, she's going to click allow no matter what it says. And I've had to reformat her computer and reinstall things when she ended up with viruses because of things like that. We should be more discerning, and we should be very wary of consent forms that are asking for a lot of scopes. Also, providers like Google and Okta and others have done a good job of iterating on their consent forms to make the information a lot more clear, because that's the job of the provider. It's the job of Google to take those scopes and translate them into a readable format, ideally one that supports internationalization, so that you see it in your default language. And so you'd clearly see Yelp wants to write to your contacts, and you might not allow that. You might think something's fishy there. So I hope that answers the question, but it has to do with intercepting and tricking and redirecting, and there are a variety of ways to do that. Some are more sophisticated than others.
Cool. Thank you for your answers, and thank you everyone for giving so much questions. I hope you, Micah, will find the time and read all of them and select the best few. So yeah, and please everyone follow Micah, and that's it. So we are switching to our closing ceremony in a few seconds. Thank you everyone, and see you soon. Okay, so everyone, I hope you enjoyed this session with Micah. It was really interesting how we can work with OAuth, which pitfalls is there. So hope everyone gets something useful. Thank you to our partner, Avenga. Thank you for your support of our community. And thank you to JetBrains. We have a few licenses, free yearly licenses to any product. Please fill the feedback form and you will have a chance to get it. And yeah, Micah will check the YouTube channel, check all questions, and the few best, I hope 2 at least, will have, I would say, tasty prizes from our community. So that's it. Follow us in all of our possible channels: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even LinkedIn. So we are happy to see you next time. Have a nice evening. Bye.